this is a good time to start. So welcome, everybody, to our session. I'd like to welcome you all. First of all, some introductory remarks about this session. The whole conference is about energy future, and our session today, tomorrow, and on Friday is about the different ways how to conceptualize the future in energy transitions. Ben Sovokul mentioned a lot of them in his talk about energy transitions today. In our session, it's about the theoretical frameworks that may be helpful when we try to figure out the specific role of the future in reconfiguring an energy system. So we want to gain a deeper understanding of how energy transition research in social, political, cultural, or geographical sciences can help to conceptualize the future. My name is Ludger Geiling. I'm a professor at the Brandenburg University of Technology in Cottbus, but 1 year ago when we planned this conference, and it was 1 year ago, I was a member of the steering board of this conference, working in the Leibniz Institute for Research on Society and Space. And I'd like to remind the speakers that they have a maximum of sort of 20 or 25 minutes for the presentation, and then we have time for the questions and discussions after each of the presentations. In this first part of our session today, we will have a little bit more time as Søren Altstedt is not here in our virtual room to present, so only 3 presenters today. Some technical issues. Firstly, the session will be recorded, then audience cannot use camera and microphone. We have 50 people in the audience right now. We collect your questions in the chat. So please, for questions and comments, use the chat and use it on the right-hand side. I will have a look on the chat so that no question or comment hopefully gets lost. And please do not use the Q&A section since only the speaker can read them. Please use the chat on the right-hand side. So let's start. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speakers, Robert Wade and Alex Miller from the School of Natural and Built Environment in Belfast.
Great. All right, Rob, are you able to share your screen and have the presentation going?
Yeah, let me know if that appears.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, and is it full screen?
Not yet on my side.
Okay. Let me see. I did something yesterday when I was trying it out.
Just for your information, whether it's full screen or not is everybody individually configures their screens at home so that you can actually control.
Okay, so the presentation is on the screen?
Oh yeah, we can.
Okay, so we're good to go.
Okay.
And maybe the 2 people who are not presenting right now, maybe you can turn off your cameras and your mics. Thank you.
Great. All right. Thanks very much, everyone. Good morning. As you said, my name's Alex Miller, and my colleague Robert and I are PhD candidates at Queen's University Belfast. And today we're going to be discussing our paper, Making Size Matter, the Cultural Political Economy of Wind Turbine Research and Innovation. We can go on to the outline. So here is an overview of what we'll be discussing today. I want to note that our data collection process and analysis is ongoing, so we'll primarily be focusing on the theoretical frameworks and initial findings from our research rather than the kind of conclusive arguments and findings that we have. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, Robert and I are both PhD candidates at Queen's University Belfast, and we're both also funded under the Mistral Research Network, which is part of the Marie Curie Sklodowska research funding under the EU. And we are both early stage researchers, part of this network, which is made up of early stage researchers and academics across Europe. And the academic focus of the network is on the social acceptance of renewable energy. And so when Rob and I were starting the PhDs, we were having kind of early discussions about some of the major trends among within the social acceptance literature. And one of the things that we kept coming across was the nature of wind turbines as seemingly getting larger and larger over time. And we started to think about what the implications of this trend might be from a social acceptance perspective, and think about, what are the long-term impacts of an ever increasing wind turbine size on issues such as community acceptance of renewable energy infrastructure. And then from that, we wanted to take a step back and look even at a more foundational question, which is, what are the underlying forces and processes involved in the trend towards larger turbines? So not just what the outcomes of having larger turbines are, but what are those actual underlying currents that are pushing that trend forward? To conduct this research, we connected with researchers at the Technical University of Denmark, as well as Wageningen University, to expand our research team. And now we've been collaborating on this paper with that group of 4 other researchers. So we can carry on to the next slide. So to begin, I think I'll try to define what we mean by an upscaling trend. So in upscaling, it refers to both the physical size of the turbines and the towers themselves, as well as the spatial deployment of wind turbines. So moving away from a pattern of deployment where you have more individual and decentralized energy to increasingly larger centralized wind farms as being the norm for the deployment of wind turbines in many regions. We can move on to the next slide. And this is a good illustration of what we mean by increasing size of wind turbines. As you can see, kind of over the period from 1990 to today, we've had an increase from under 1 megawatt to over 10 megawatts per turbine. And we can go to the next slide. And this kind of is an example of the deployment of wind turbines in Denmark. And it kind of demonstrates this trend in terms of the actual contribution of energy to the grid by the size of turbine. So it kind of underlines how significant these increasingly large turbines are in terms of overall energy production. All right, next slide. So this is just to kick us off with the discussion on our theoretical framework. So our research is situated within the field of science and technology studies. And most of the literature on the evolution of wind turbines explain it from a technological or efficiency or economic perspective, and portray it largely as a value neutral process of gradual technical change. But STS can ask us to go beyond these explanations to examine the social and cultural implications embedded within these technological processes and outcomes. And we're reminded that science and technology evolve dialectically and are not evolving in isolation, but rather in terms of the feedback between science and society and culture as distinct areas. They're working together over time to shape each other. And then within the field of science and technology studies, the cultural political economy of research and innovation, or CPERI, is an approach articulated by David Tyfield and asks us to pay closer attention to the political economy and power dimensions of scientific and technical change. And this is an interesting way to approach the question because, as I said, it has been portrayed largely as a value neutral, very technical process without kind of necessarily representing anything in terms of political struggle or power. But through this theoretical approach, we're able to take a more critical perspective. So Tyfield's understanding of CPERI has helped to guide our investigation into the upscaling trend within the wind energy sector. And I'll just speak briefly about this image on the screen here. This is something adapted from Hessen Savakul, which helps to explain the nature of socio-technical matters and the different lines of inquiry you can take into understanding the kind of, you have the material and technical as well as the kind of embedded social and political dimensions to it. And that's in the technology itself, but also the way in which it's deployed and the various processes and networks set up in association with it. So I'll now pass it over to Rob, if you want to carry on.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so as Alex said, most of the literature on wind turbine innovation and upscaling is from a technical or economic point of view, although there has been some work from an SCS perspective, which has been quite influential and quite important. And perhaps the most dominant and probably well-known explanation is by Garud and Carnot. And they make this distinction between bricolage and breakthrough. And the key, I suppose, the key story here is that the Danish wind turbine industry was ultimately successful, or more successful than other industries, such as in the US or Germany, because they adopted a bricolage approach, which was developed independently of government R&D programs, and was primarily by enthusiastic amateurs and skilled artisans. Whereas other countries adopted a breakthrough top-down science-based approach, aiming for larger turbines from the outset, and this failed ultimately. However, Hendry and Harbone have challenged this and said that ultimately the science-based breakthrough approach did ultimately reassert itself, and this was ultimately decisive for long-term success of the industry. In particular, the EU played a particularly important role here and drove upscaling from the 1990s onwards with important projects. What we want to do is maybe take a step back from this storyline, and I want to draw attention to the quote from Hendry and Harbone, which at the end of the quote they say, which is ultimately decisive for long-term success, and sort of just ask, well, what does success mean? And it seems that both of these approaches seem to have a shared understanding of success. And I guess an STS approach would ask you to question that, and what does success actually mean? How is that framed? And that becomes a political question then. And I think one of the best examples of this is a PhD and ultimately a book by Rini van Est called Winds of Change in 1999. And he outlined what he calls wind energy innovation networks. And these are ultimately political coalitions with emerging from the social and historical context. In both, he did a comparison of Denmark and the US, and he identified 5 different types of wind energy innovation networks: flexible, cooperative, communal, civilian, and entrepreneurial. And these different networks had different visions or imaginaries of what wind turbine technology should be, who its users should be, who should build it. And in the case of Denmark, is the presentation gone?
I think, yeah.
Okay. I don't know why that happened.
Yeah, it's back now.
Yeah. And in the case of Denmark, the main storyline is that ultimately there was a flexible approach, a flexible coalition which envisioned that utilities would own and operate, and large firms would build the turbines. And there was a push for upscaling, and Riso was the main test center there. And there's a cooperative coalition who envisages the network of local innovators and cooperative firms who would produce the turbines, and they would be primarily used by communities or cooperatives. And ultimately, there was these two coalitions came together and reached a sort of a peaceful coexistence in what he called the flexible ecological wind energy innovation network. And there, those bullet points there sort of give the main points of that of that coalition in terms of science techniques. So Riso was a test center, and there was also private research and innovation within firms. They were professional and medium-sized firms. The customers were both cooperatives and the electrical utilities. So that shows that this was the coexistence of these two different competing visions and interests. And they came together with a politics of sustainable grow and build. For the flexible coalition, from the outset, industrial development and was really the main goal. But there was an environmental strand in the cooperative network. So they developed a shared ideology, which he defines as ecological modernization. So that's a bit of the story, and I think that's a useful conceptual basis from which we develop our research questions. And our aim is to trace these political economic logics and how they have guided the field of wind turbine technology since then in Denmark and at the EU level. And these are our preliminary, our working research questions. So how is the upscaling trend being shaped in Denmark and EU by different types of policies and underlying coalitions? And how are forces for upscaling, downscaling, shape by and shaping R&I initiatives at the EU and Danish levels today? And what does this entail for co-production of wind turbine technology and future policy directions? So briefly, our methods, we use a case study approach. We wanted to look at Denmark, but because of the increasing importance of the EU, especially since the 90s, we thought it was also important to look at the EU at the EU level too, to see the interactions between those two levels of governance. We did a policy analysis, and we also mapped EU research and innovation funding using the Cordis database. And we've conducted key informed interviews, and are still conducting interviews with engineers, scientists, policymakers, advocates, and industry representatives from both the large and small turbine industry. So some initial results from our policy analysis, we've sort of extracted some key themes from the policies we've looked at the EU and Danish level. And at the EU level, economic cost efficiency and cost reduction is probably the dominant value that we see in the project and in the policy discourse, and the levelized cost of energy, LCOE, is a key metric that has guided the industry for quite a while now. The move to offshore has also been very prominent in recent years. Competitiveness, economic growth, and building the European industrial base. Climate change mitigation, of course, is an important element of the discourse, and the role of private sector research and innovation. Over 70% of research and innovation funding is done by the private sector in the wind industry now, so that's an important element to consider too. And that's also important to consider that that's also a policy choice as well, to an extent. So from the Danish level, we have a move to more market-based price setting mechanisms and subsidies, and more recently in 2018, the introduction of auctions, municipal and national planning law, where height restrictions have been progressively removed or increased, and removed more recently. Then there was national science, technology, innovation policies, which have also favoured upscaling, and land scarcity also emerges as a theme, as a reason, a rationale for moving offshore, and also for upscaling. The climate targets again, and cost efficiency and cost reduction, LCOE. So there's quite similar themes at both levels. We also looked at the Cordis database of EU-funded projects for Framework Programme 7 and Framework Programme 8. So 2007-2013 was Framework Programme 7. And as you can see here, this was to see if, I suppose, the money followed the discourse, and largely it did. Cost reduction, the move to offshore received a lot of projects, which is the bars, and also more money, which is the line. Associated infrastructure as well. It should also be noted that that is also a byproduct, I suppose, of upscaling. That the need to connect large wind farms to a centralized grid system is also linked to that process. There are some funding for micro wind turbine projects, and oftentimes these were presented as rooftop or urban rooftop turbines. So so not necessarily small turbines that would be out in rural areas. Yeah, so that trend sort of continued in Framework Program 8, and we'll see. I suppose it remains to be seen for Horizon Europe Framework Program 9. So what can we sort of infer from these themes and these trends about, I suppose, underlying cultural, political economy and the state of that coalition that Van Nest identified in 1999? It seems to be the case that ecological modernization has remained a key imaginary or discourse guiding the development of the technology, and within this, it's what David Tyfield calls a neoliberal marketplace for ideas. So the market is seen as the key instrument that should guide innovation. So cost reduction, cost parity with fossil fuels is seen as the primary value, and competitiveness and growth of the industry are also important elements, and of course climate change mitigation targets, which are also important. So this has led to these sort of trends, and these values have driven the upscaling trend, and have been used as justifications for upscaling at both the Danish and EU levels. However, this upscaling trend has created some issues for the maybe cooperative element of that coalition that he identified back in 1999. So, for example, the higher capex costs associated with larger wind turbines, and the increasing professionalization required to deal with these large infrastructures, has created some challenges, which Van Nest in 1999 actually foresaw. And there are two, I suppose, sort of strategies which he identified they could take, and this is actually how it seems to have played out too. The first one is that cooperatives should professionalize or become institutionalized, and maybe res co-op is an example of that. So in other words, they go with the increasing technology, they accept it, and they try to adopt it. And this also might be associated with a move from co-ops being communities of place to communities of interest, as they need more members and more funding to fund these technologies. So there you see the interaction between technology and the organizational structure. And the second strategy is to form an autonomous wind energy innovation network based on localism and appeal to environmental values. And the small and medium wind industry has, in a sense, taken this this role. And the Nordic Folk Center in Denmark was already established in 1983 to promote this vision, which is in contrast to the vision, to the ecological modernization vision. And we just have some quotes from the interviews we conducted, which might demonstrate some of these trends. So the first quote is from an interview with a small wind energy consultant. He says, "Very little has been done to promote the small wind sector, to make it develop. I think some people who have the responsibility for developing wind in general have thought that wind is most economical if you do it large scale. So that's the way to go, period. And then they have somehow closed their eyes to these other aspects." And then when we spoke to large wind turbine manufacturer, when asked about the small wind industry, they said they should stop. I think it's a bad idea. We don't have anything to do with them, not as an industry, not as a sector, nothing at all. So that's quite a stark contrast. And in an interview with the Danish Energy Agency, they said, "We don't see any value in smaller projects. It's of more value, more efficient to put up larger installations in fewer places if we are to meet Denmark's climate ambitions and at the lowest possible price." So that's, I suppose, the ecological modernization discourse or imaginary summed up in that quote. Just an interesting, in terms of the state of the cooperative element of the innovation network, we did look at the Danish wind turbine database, and I don't know if you can see here. I don't know if you can see my cursor there. No? Okay, well, in around 2015, 2016, marked, there seems to be a large increase, if you can see that. It's the blue, in small turbines, so 0 to 100 kilowatts again. So that's in contrast. So that's from, this graph is a number of turbines, so it's not megawatt capacity, which was the previous graphs. Now, obviously, this large number of small turbines didn't even appear on the previous graph, because that was in megawatt capacity terms. But there did seem to be a bit of a boost in Denmark of commissioning of smaller turbines in that period, which we haven't actually explained that trend yet. But that's maybe that sign of a revitalization of that sector. So some of the implications. So what are the implications of these trends? From a co-production or social acceptance perspective, obviously there are different concepts, but I'll go through both of them now. Sorry about that. So in terms of co-production, the co-production concept is a useful one, and I suppose you can think about it in two ways. The first one is generally, so that's science and technology always co-produce each other, or technology is always produced by society, whether you recognize it or not, and that's, I suppose, the fundamental idea of STS. But then there's more formalized sense of co-production, I suppose, that in terms of co-production processes or requirements in funding or projects, that you get society or societal perspectives involved in the process. And there's a quote from David Tyfield here, which I think is good critique of that more formalized approach. And he says, he warns that it might just be a boutique luxury incorporated by the neoliberal regime. That to what extent do these formalized co-production processes actually influence these embedded values in the design process? And that, I suppose, is related to the issue of social acceptance, because I think oftentimes co-production, in this formal sense, is used, is employed to increase social acceptance. So it's usually the position is, we have this technology, it's a given, and then how can we get societal or social science perspectives on board to increase the social acceptance of this technology? But maybe that's what we're trying to critique, in the sense that if the technology is already co-produced with other values embedded in it, then it's in a sense too late, and maybe social acceptability as opposed to social acceptance is a better concept in this sense, because it's broader, and it's understood as a collective choice of an energy social contract that's intrinsically problematic because it is political. So in conclusion, wind energy technology is neither neutral nor an autonomous force. It shapes and is shaped by the underlying cultural political economy. Efficiency has remained a dominant value, with levelized cost of energy being the most important metric. And this is used, and efficiency is used by all sides of the political spectrum to evaluate the wind turbine technology. So, for example, an example from Northern Ireland, recently the wind turbine industry has been criticised there from both sides because of a large proportion of the turbines installed are small and inefficient, and therefore are costing the taxpayer. Now, the reasons for that ultimately could be due to the political economic situation, such as the role of the farming community there. But it's just an interesting point to note that it's a hegemonic value on both sides of the political spectrum. It also should be noted that upscaling could have occurred within a different wind energy innovation network. This isn't to say that upscaling is just an outcome ecological modernization. It could have occurred under a different political economic system, but it may have taken on different material or symbolic forms. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thanks. Oh, actually, sorry, I had one quote, which but we can leave it as it. You can just read it yourself. Cheers.
Yeah, thank you very much, Robert and Alex. I hope you hear the applause. That is not there, but there is applause, and I'm sure there is something like an applause in the audience. So now it's time for questions. We have up to 10 minutes for questions and comments, and so please type your messages on the right-hand side. And Katja Müller already started, and you see the question yourself, Alex and Robert. So could you please give an answer to Katja's question?
Rob, I'll let you take the lead on that one.
Yeah, so if I think if I understand it correctly, is upscaling contradictory to a smaller or a cooperative approach to the energy transition? And if I think that if that's the question, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think it's not necessarily, and that's, I suppose, where the two sort of strategies for the cooperative I suppose coalition comes into play. So it may be possible to continue upscaling, but to go with upscaling trend, but it does create issues in terms of affordability of these turbines, and also just competing with large developers, especially as we're moving consistently to more market-based subsidy schemes. That how can cooperatives compete? And when there's economies of scale associated with larger turbines and larger wind farms, yeah, it might be tricky. Now in Ireland, we have recently introduced an auction scheme where there's a small category set aside for community energy. So maybe that's one solution.
Okay, then another question. Did you come across any alternative discourses to a neoliberal one in the policy analysis?
In the policy analysis, no, I don't think so.
I don't. Yeah, I think like if we go back to Tyfield's conceptualization of the cultural political economy of research and innovation, he does a good job of mapping out like the multiple different approaches in terms of the neoliberal approach, more like state-centered innovation approach, and then co-production as a field as well. And I'd say that most of the content that we saw from the policy analysis, especially in terms of the framework program and the set plans, was centered around either the kind of Keynesian style statism of like a state-driven innovation approach, or this neoliberal market idea of making it primarily on the private sector. And through our mapping of the funding of projects, for example, under the framework programs, I think we had a section for co-production, kind of more like social approaches to wind energy innovation as a field. And those were among the lowest numbers of projects, both like proposed and funded. So I'd say that the alternative discourses, if they are there, they're not the ones getting funding, and they're not the ones that are being advanced, at least at the EU and national level in Denmark.
And those social science approaches, like our project, are very much sort of, it's technology neutral in a sense. It's, we have this technology, how can we improve its acceptance? Now I think co-production is going to be a bigger theme in Horizon Europe. So it would be interesting to see how it's framed in those project funding calls. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, as there's no other question, I'll use the opportunity to ask the speakers. An energy transition is not only about building up new infrastructures, but also about, so it's not only about innovation, but perhaps it's also about something like exnovation, like phasing out from coal, from gas, from oil. So what do you think? Does your perspective also helps to understand exnovations, not only innovations? And in which way?
I think so. My PhD research focuses on path dependency and carbon lock-in, which is related to that concept of exnovation and kind of the alternate paths away from a kind of fossil fuel-based energy system. So I guess in referring to this research, it is kind of, you know, it comes back to this framing of choices between the different transition paths, and so it's this idea of you have, you know, I suppose the dominant, especially like neoliberal and technical narrative, which we have identified, is the dominant way in which the energy transition is presented, and perhaps in an earlier stage in many places, and at a smaller scale, there is this kind of community-driven approach, and there's this idea of a decentralized community energy as like the alternative vision to a centralized fossil fuel energy grid. So I suppose that it kind of ties back to that in terms of the choices on the sustainable energy side have sort of won out towards this larger, more centralized approach to wind energy development. Do you think that's fair, Rob?
Yeah, I think so.
So Katja had another question about the methodology, asking as an anthropologist, would it not be better to work with affected people on the ground when investigating the impact of these massive turbines?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's something that we were discussing recently, that that's probably the next phase if we're to do another bit of research to maybe make that more explicit empirical connection between size and how people relate to technology. But that's it's the next step, and it's probably too much for one piece of research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I'll put a plug in for the Mistral Research Network as well, because it's made up of 15 PhD students who are conducting research on the broad swath of the social acceptance of renewable energy, and that includes people with more of an anthropological focus or more kind of community-based local, looking at local responses to energy, as well as my own research looks at the more like high-level socio-political dimensions of it at like a federal or national policy and political level. So there's the different conceptions of social acceptance, and the different methods are appropriate for the different types of social acceptance, and hopefully the policy analysis is appropriate for the level of analysis that we're taking here.
So, okay, thank you very much, Robert. Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you for the people who had questions and comments. So let's move on to the second speaker.
Thank you.
Let's move on to Abdullah Fahimi. You are there, Abdullah? Right, you are perfect. So I'm delighted to introduce you. You come from the Leuphana University in Lüneburg in Germany, and you will tell us something about a very important conceptualization of the future socio-technical imaginaries, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I will show our slides. Do you see this? Do you see my presentation? Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you. I think you can make it large on your own screen, because I noticed that sometimes it looks small. So yeah, this I'm presenting our work. So this is the work of myself, Paul Upham, Sibyl Münch, and I present this, which is about Afghanistan's energy socio-technical imaginaries, alternative visions in a conflict zone. Yeah, So introduction, aims and objectives of the study, theory, research approach. Yeah, this is how I will go about. Okay. Yeah, so to help me explain and help you understand the case, I introduced a context. Afghanistan is a country located at the crossroads of Central Asia and South Asia. So it's sometimes grouped. Okay, am I changing the slides or somebody else? But anyway, so it's at the crossroads of Central Asia and South Asia. Sometimes it's grouped with South Asia, sometimes it's with Central Asia, but it's in between. And this is important for the next slides and the imaginaries that we present, that we understand the geographical location of the country. And 20 terrorist groups, so many terrorist groups are fighting the government of Afghanistan, and they contest and control a large portion of the territory. So almost more than 50% of the territory in Afghanistan is contested, so not completely controlled by the government. And on top of that, to make things more complicated and more unstable and uncertain, there are many powers and regional countries who have their interest and follow their interest in Afghanistan, and they also even play their rivalries. So their rivalries play out in Afghanistan. For example, the rivalry between US and Russia, or China, India, I don't know, India, Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iran, US. So all these rivalries also play in Afghanistan. Interestingly, there's so much that everyone thinks there is something for them to fight for influence. Coming to the energy sector, since 2001, when the Taliban regime was overthrown with the help of the international community, there has been significant progress in the energy sector as well as the other sectors. But in the energy sector, in 2001, we had the country had 5% access to electricity grid, so the population, 5% of the population. But now it's around 30 to 35%, and also because of so many years of wars, because since end of 1970s, 80s, so the country experienced war. So the institutions really were not functioning anymore. The infrastructure was ruined. But now that the institution and the regulatory landscape of the energy sector is taking shape, and these all of these progress can be attributed to the role that aid agencies have played, both financially but also technically. They know that they have the know-how and the financial power. This is the map, but I explain it because it's also important that for explaining our imaginaries. So if you see Afghanistan, the darker red areas, they are controlled by insurgent groups, and the lighter ones are by the government. But if you look at the location, so to the north you have the Central Asian former Soviet Union countries, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and they are rich in terms of energy resources, particularly the fossil reserves. And to the south, you see Pakistan, and then down India. And these block of countries, they are considered energy poor because they don't have much reserves of fossil fuels. And they are, I don't know if that term is appropriate anymore. And to the east, we share the country shares its second longest border with Iran, and the longest is with Pakistan. So this is important for our imaginaries. That's why I'm explaining this. These are some of the maps of the renewable sources, but I think I will not have time to explain these. But these are solar, wind, biomass, and So coming to our study, as I was explaining in the introduction, that there are more than 20 terrorist groups fighting the government. So the situation is really unstable politically. There are many uncertainties politically and economically, the country experienced really rapid growth, but that was really, yeah, I would say an illusion, because this was because of the large amounts of foreign aid that poured into the country. So, but things are politically, have been politically and economically, there are uncertainties. And in times of uncertainties and against this background, the study of visions, future visions and imaginaries become even more important. So we wanted to, in this study, we wanted to study the energy imaginaries. And one of our aims is to identify the energy socio-technical imaginaries. And also because imaginaries hold within them claims to power. So there are interest groups. And for this reason, we will also, in this study, we also explore the political dynamics and how these imaginaries interact with the interests of certain group of players or certain countries or actors inside the country. Yeah. So according to this, our aims, so the theory, we borrow from the socio-technical imaginaries concept, yeah, mainly the work of Professor Sheila Jezanov, which we hope to have a keynote from, yeah, I think it's on Thursday. So mainly her work and her co-author, Kim, socio-technical imaginaries refer to collectively held and publicly performed visions of desirable futures. So here you notice collectively held and performed undesirable futures. These are keywords. So a vision or an imagination that is collectively held among a community and that can be performed, and it says about how the future ought to be. So desirable futures. It also contain within it the resistance to undesirable events in the future. For example, if we take and these visions can be performed, to materialized, realized. For example, if we take the examples from Professor Jesanov's book, that, for example, these big examples such as flying or space traveling or deep sea exploration, these were all imaginations before they were decades later they were realized or materialized. Yeah, so imaginaries, as you can see in the examples, and imaginaries can influence behavior, policies, and institutions. Imaginaries are born from the past, but can shape our today's actions, today's policies. So what we expect to happen in the future should certainly come in the policy of today. So that's why imaginaries are really they do influence policies. And as I was saying in the beginning of the theory part, that the imaginaries are collectively held. Yeah, they can, however, originate from a single individual's idea or a vision, but they can only become or get the status of an imaginary when it's publicly held, when it's shared among a group of people. And how can that happen? It's by exercise of power, but also by with other institutions such as media or legislations, yeah, and acts of coalition building. For the power part, to discuss the power aspects, we draw on conceptualization of discursive power instead of the pluralistic definition, which more or less is about how power, in which power is defined as the ability to dominate the behavior of others. We take a more we use a conceptualization that understands power as a positive force, a productive force, and in a bigger word, bigger sense, a government, actually, power as government. So And discursive power is defined as to the degree, refers to the degree to which the categories of thought, civilizations, and linguistic conventions and meaningful models of and for the world determine the ability of some actors to control the actions of others or to obtain new capacities. So language here is really important. Discourses, language, and language is not only a mean to understand the realities, but it also shape our understanding of how what the realities are. So our research approach is an interpretive approach. We combine document analysis with semi-structured interviews. Why semi-structured interviews with experts? Is because energy planning or energy futures, it's not a topic of public debate. So it's not discussed in the public. That's why it's only in the there are other probably urgent security topics the public probably engage with, but energy is discussed mostly in circles of energy experts or policymakers. So we interviewed with 14 experts, and they represented the government of Afghanistan, aid agencies, and academic institutions. And policy documents, we studied 6 of them and combined with these interviews. Why policy documents? Again, here, according to the theory, Professor Jazanov's works, that policy documents, legislations, these are the sources of language of power or the state, and they hold within them imaginaries of the state, imaginaries of the government. So we dig there to study what the imaginaries of the government, for example, is in them in these documents. So the findings. This is somewhat departing from our expectations. So these imaginaries that we have three of them. They do not. They are not complete configurations, alternative configurations, but they can be understood as more 3 parts or 3 dimensions of one system. But they are imaginaries within dominant imaginaries within their own dimension. For example, energy importation, the dominant imaginary in that dimension is Afghanistan as an energy corridor. And here also comes, I will explain in the next slide, the geographical location that it sits between this block of Central Asian energy-rich countries and South Asian energy-poor countries. And then energy sources. The dominant imaginary is that an affordable and least cost energy supply should be prioritized over only focusing on renewables. But again, I explained the drivers of these in the next slides. And the third dimension, the scale of energy technology, how big the projects, the off-grid, grid connected. So that the dominant imaginary here is that grid expansion to urban, densely populated centers and off-grid projects for rural areas, which have really sparsely populated areas, and they're also inaccessible. So this is the first imaginary in the dimension of energy importation, Afghanistan as an energy corridor. And this is the imaginary that has the most support among the actors, from the government to agencies and also the regional players. And this imaginary finds its origin actually in a broader imaginary, and another imaginary broader, but which is much broader. It's the Afghanistan as land bridge between Central Asia and South Asia. And in this, Afghanistan would act as a bridge to carry goods and everything. So it's not just about energy, but this imaginary is in there. That's the mother of this imaginary. Why is there such a strong perception and such a strong imaginary that Afghanistan acts as a land bridge between these two block of countries? It's because historically, if you look at Afghanistan's history, the country sits along the path of the old or the Silk Road, which originated from China and went to the West and carried goods and ideas. So Afghanistan was on this path, and for that reason, the people have now a perception of a really strategic, important location. But this is not the only thing. If you come to a more recent history of the country acted as a buffer state between, in the 19th century, it acted as a buffer state between the British India and the Russian Empire. Both these superpowers were trying to gain influence in the country and maybe expand their territories or influence. So again, this was a buffer state between these two blocks. But later in the 20th century, in the Cold War and around that time, the country was a buffer state between the Soviet Union and this time with America. And both of these superpowers, again, poured money, but also fought for influence. And for this reason, this is a really long cultural property, this imaginary that Afghanistan acts as a land bridge between these two block of countries. So the energy corridor actually also originates from this imaginary. And if you look even just a quick look at the media, the policy documents of the Afghan government, and the legislation, not the legislation, but policy documents, you see these terms really everywhere. For example, I just had a quick look at the media, and you see strategic location, you see heart of Asia. So this is really, really deep, the mother imaginary I'm talking about. Transit hub for the region, a bridge between Central Asia and South Asia, land bridge. So you see how deep and strong this imaginary is. And even today, the Silk Road, even in today's geopolitics of the region, if you look at the Chinese BRI and even the American attempt of making new geographies, you see this also fits in there, this imaginary of Afghanistan as land bridge. For example, the US tries to bring or pull this former Soviet Union countries and promote more interaction between these former Soviet Union countries in Central Asia with South Asia in terms of energy, in terms of other business dealings. But and then Russia has another narrative, another imaginary, you can even call it, and that is that of Eurasia, in which in that narrative Russia sits in the center of everything, and then Central Asian countries are in the periphery, but it's just more or less not really connected with South Asia, but more connected with Russia. So things go to Russia and then beyond and to Europe. So in Chinese, they have their own version of Silk Road and their own BRI now. And India their own. So there is so much in play. But if you look at these countries which are involved in the energy trade, these Central Asian countries, they are happy to export their energy to South Asia. And this helps the Afghan imaginary of Afghanistan as a land bridge, as an energy corridor, sorry. And this is a famous quote from the current Afghan president, which was in India, said breakfast in Delhi, lunch in Peshawar. Peshawar is a city in Pakistan, and dinner in Kabul. That's the world we seek. And this is discussed. If you look at the discursive promotion of this, discursively, how this is promoted is, I just showed you these examples, but also in the government, the speeches of the leaders, and everywhere you see Afghanistan as a hub, corridor, an energy corridor, everything. And they have taken practical steps too. They have joined the Shanghai Economic Cooperation practically to materialize this imaginary. They have taken part in Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India gas pipeline. They have initiated air transit routes to these regional countries, and many more steps have been taken practically to realize this imaginary. And now moving on to the other two imaginaries. I hope I'm not taking too much time. On the energy sources dimension, the dominant imaginary is that least cost energy supply should be prioritized. This has many drivers. One is that Afghanistan has a really negligible carbon footprint or CO2 emissions. The average is that per capita per year, it's 0.2 metric tons in 2016. This was, and if you compare that to the EU, it's 6.5 metric tons per capita per year. And even South Asia, which is also a poor region, has a much higher, it's 1.5. Compare that to the 0.2 metric tons of Afghanistan. So the experts believe this is the CO2 emissions are really, really low, negligible, and the economic development should take much more importance. And because so many people live under the poverty line, so they think the imaginary must be that of least cost energy supply. So not really prioritizing only renewables, but yeah, they think that if renewables prove to be economically and environmentally the best option, then why not? Of course. Here I've pasted some quotes from interviews. The climate impact of electrification in Afghanistan is marginal. It doesn't matter too much given there is no industry. There is no industry, so as you've seen in the CO2 emissions. Yeah, so that's one of the drivers of energy sources, the imaginary on this dimension. And the other was, of course, that economic development should take more importance here. And on the scale of energy technology, so what should the country build off-grid projects or more grid-connected? Here, there are the dominant imaginary, I should remind you again, is that of here is that grid expansion for rural, for urban densely populated centers and off-grid projects for rural, sparsely populated areas. So this has many two other drivers. One is that Afghanistan is also geographically divided. The Hindu Kush mountains divide the country into south and north, and some areas are really inaccessible. And some areas are also really sparsely populated that if you expand the grid, it's really costly. And the cost of providing off-grid solutions is much lower. So this is one thing because of inaccessibility and the mountainous terrain and the geography, basically. But other thing that I was explaining in the introduction, that so many terrorist groups operate in the country, is also a driver of this energy imaginary, that off-grid projects. Because based on evidence, there are studies that smaller off-grid projects attracted less attacks. There, since 1989, I have here in my notes, there have been 319, I think, if I'm not wrong, 319 attacks on infrastructural projects in Afghanistan, and around 50 attacks on energy alone. And these attacks are continuing. And the larger the infrastructure, the project, the bigger the risk of attacks. So the experts believe that off-grid projects are much more resilient in the face of attacks, and so for that reason, this is also another driver. Yeah, this is the last slide, and according to theories, there is not just one dominant imaginary in a group or community and a society, but there are competing imaginaries. And also in our study, we found competing imaginaries, but they were not very dominant or competing really with the dominant ones, but there were nevertheless competing imaginaries. For example, in terms of the energy importation dimension that I presented. Another competing imaginary is that development of domestic resources, only focusing on the domestic resources. Another, for example, in the dimension of energy sources, the competing imaginary is the giving priority to renewables, so completely renewables. So these are the competing imaginaries. Or off-grid solutions has another competing imaginary in the form of a national unified grid. So yeah, I hope I'm on time. Yeah. Thank you very much. And if you have questions, you can also write to us, but I will also answer some here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Abdullah. Applause from the audience for your inspiring talk. And you have already three big, rather big questions. The first one was from Orlan. Two questions from Orlan. What distinction would you make between imaginary scenarios and narratives? Is the first question. And the second one, what would you think about the design of energy futures and imaginaries in relation to COVID-19? So big questions.
Wow. Okay. These are really, really big questions, and I'm really hoping forward. I'm really looking forward to the keynote by Professor Jesanov, because she would be really. Yeah, she would be answering much better than me, but I try to make an attempt. I hope, yeah, I'm also still learning. So imaginaries, yeah, this is also a very important question, actually. Imaginaries, how are they different from other concepts, similar concepts such as discourse, narratives, or in this case, policies, or if I lost this, yeah, scenarios, and yeah. So, for example, in the case of scenarios, if you look at, for example, only scenarios here, if I only answer you this question about the scenarios is really, I think it's really narrow, and it's not so culturally deep in the society. It's mostly from a top-down attempt of policy making or scenario building. And in terms of narratives, according to Professor Jesanov's work, a master narrative, or a narrative in this case, implies a more monolithic and unchangeable vision, closely bound to singular retelling of national and cultural history, and not necessarily welcoming of invention or prescriptive of new goals to be achieved. So these are the differences, but I really hope that I have at least made, contributed a little, but really I'm also looking forward to learn about these. And the second part is, what would you think about the design of energy futures in relation to COVID? Yeah, in the case, so we studied the case of Afghanistan, and in the case of Afghanistan, and this, by the way, this study is already completed. So in the case of Afghanistan, much more urgent topics, other topics are much more urgent. It's not that COVID is not so urgent, but the security, the attacks, insurgencies, these are more urgent, and why we did not really take into account the COVID crisis in our study.
So, okay, next question from Jessica.
I'm really sorry if I couldn't answer them properly.
So, next question from Jessica. One question: what kind of questions do you ask experts to capture the imaginaries? Just give short examples. And then second, when you talk about imaginaries, how many years in the future do you talk about? So it's about 3 to 5 years, or 20, 30 years?
Very good question. We asked our experts very broad questions. This related to the role of actors, to how they can help, and what, more importantly, to imaginaries. And your question is, what should the next, what should the future energy system of Afghanistan should look like. That was the question that generated probably these answers to our study. And regarding the timeline, we actually we left this open. We just asked how do you think the energy should look like, the energy system in the future, based on, of course, the current situation. So we did not, in short, no time frame. We did not take that.
Then also a big question from Joni. What steps did you take in your analysis? So what analytical methods, thematic analysis, discourse analysis, and were these three imaginaries easy to identify, or did you have to leave out some elements?
Yeah. Okay. So this was a document analysis. Yeah. Discourse analysis, document analysis. I don't know. They are really also similar to each other. But so we studied the documents and qualitative. It's a qualitative study, of course, and we coded the data, and then the themes emerged around these dimensions that I just presented. And when the themes emerge from, for example, these themes emerge from the interview data, then we checked this also in the policy documents, if these themes were also in the policy documents. And then when these themes, these dominant themes that emerged, then they emerged around these three dimensions. And that's where we get our three imaginaries. And yeah, the more this was emphasized by the documents and the interviewees, that's where we get the dominant ones.
So, and then Valeria had a question, are these more political elite narratives? So are the people in Afghanistan related to these imaginaries, or only the political elites?
Yeah, if you are asking about that that broader imaginary which I presented in the beginning of that Afghanistan as a land bridge between Central Asia and South Asia, that's a much stronger and much deeper and also much more publicly held imaginaries. It's also in the public, but we cannot claim that imaginaries as an energy corridor that we presented in this paper is also at the view of public, because we did not consult them, we did not ask them, and that's because this is not a topic of public debate in Afghanistan. It doesn't really get much attention in the public debate. So it's more the views of a network of experts, and of course the government of Afghanistan.
So, and then another question from Timothy Moss about the political side of it. How far has energy infrastructure been selected by funding agencies as a way of depoliticizing the conflict? So is energy seen as an instrument of advancing cooperation, or is energy recognized by the key actors as a field that is deeply political and contested, reflecting wider conflicts?
Yeah, okay, this is really a big but really interesting question, and actually we are working on another paper which really deals with this question, how the aid agencies have contributed to the development of the sector and what they have done. So one thing I can already say from our new paper is that, we have just begun, is that aid agencies have also followed their own agenda in Afghanistan. They implement projects that appeal to the constituents back home, to the taxpayers in the US, in Germany, and they do not really align their projects with the interests or the priority programs of the government of Afghanistan. So yeah, there are more than 30 aid agencies operating in the country, and they follow their own agendas in some cases. Yeah, okay, I hope I got some of this.
And then the last question from Jana Zabanova: is Afghanistan looking at the experience of other developing countries in managing an energy transition? Are there countries that serve as referential models in that? Yes, because this is also now a case of knowledge transfer, technology transfer.
because there are so many aid agencies and because the government of Afghanistan lacks capacity, both financially and technically, so most of these programs, they come from many other countries. The Germans have implemented their idea of a good project, or the Americans their own, and they have brought their own experience to Afghanistan, their own technologies in some cases, their own knowledge. So yeah, I think this is just a mashing of all these experiences in the country. So yeah, of course, it does look up to the other models.
So, Abdullah, thank you very much for your inspiring talk and also for the many questions and your precise answers. And then we should move on to from Lüneburg in Afghanistan to Trier. And I'd like to hand over, Trier is also in Germany, I'd like to hand over to you, to Sarah Larijani from the Trier University in Germany. And she did some changes to her abstract, so we are very curious. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the intro. Yeah, I'm Sarah, a PhD candidate at the Trier University Governance and Sustainability Lab. One moment, I forgot to turn on my notes. Yes, now. The title of my presentation, as you see, is Beyond Occidental Energy Futures. Before I start the presentation, let us first go to the picture. What is the problematic in this picture? Is it the smoke from those chimneys on the riverside, the ship and those trucks which are polluting the environment? Is it the way this landscape is altered? This drawing is a manifestation of what once was the protagonist of progress, and today it could be a prototype of what is commonly held as polluting and unsustainable. But what this drawing does not show. I will get back to this picture and the importance of its hidden features later. This presentation is part of a conceptual paper with the same title, and it is situated in broader fields of socio-technical system research, as well as post-colonial Marxist geography. It takes up the recently introduced socio-technical imaginaries framework, henceforth STIs, and critically engaged with the writing of Jasanoff, who has prominent theoretical contribution to this framework. How do I go next? Yes. The method of this, the paper is theory adaptation. First, the main theory under study is investigated for its shortcoming. Then a second set of theories is introduced to fill the gap in the main theory. The outline, as you see, first, an introduction to the topic. Second, a short intro to STIs and its shortcoming. Then I will apply technologies of humility, another approach introduced by Sheila Jasanoff. And I will apply this to STI's modernity by utilizing Fernando Coronel's conceptualization of modernity. Following, I illustrate this alternative perspective through an example from my research project, my PhD research project, the oil industry in Southwest Iran. At the end, I raised some concerns about the socio-technical imaginaries of future green energy. So this panel has been organized around conceptualizing the future in energy transition. That is to understand future, this vague term, in the processes of change, actually a radical change if we think about energy systems. The key dimensions which are often considered in conceptualizing future are the relationality of past, present, and future, the normative dimension, what is a good future, utopias and dystopias in a larger sense, and the multiplicity of future visions, the competing one, even antagonistic desirable futures. One of the prominent theories which recognizes these dimensions and systematically deal with them is STI framework, as also Abdullah was using in his presentation. And as he said, it is introduced by Sheila Jasanoff and Sang-Hyun Kim. I argue that STIs overlook a fourth dimension in dominant imaginaries, perhaps the most essential one if we imagine the future radically different from the present. This dimension is the epistemological order through which those first three questions are posed and answered. In short, if we are to imagine future energy systems radically different from the current status, interrogating the dominant epistemic lens in science and technology must be at the center of investigation of socio-technical imaginaries. Due to the time constraints, this presentation's reference to SDI framework will be limited to Dreamscapes of Modernity, Socio-Technical Imaginaries and Fabrication of Power, the prominent book edited by Jasanoff and Tim in 2015. As Abdullah a little bit explained about the theory, I do not read this quote anymore. I just go that SDI framework theorizes how techno-scientific and the social order are interconnected. The framework reveals how the scientific and technological innovations from their originating moment until their extension and realization are in constant contact with various established institutions as well as the prevailing perceptions of the world of desirable or undesirable futures. Thereby, it captures the idea that the realization of visions of desirable futures are complex processes in which amalgamation of social order and disorder and the complex power relations are mediated through and moved forward by science and technology. I have identified four important political dimensions in the SDI's framework. In this presentation, I go directly to the last bullet point. SDI sheds light on the interconnection of power relations and socio-technical visions. This perspective enables SDIs to situate politics at the heart of desirable futures. Jasanoff believes revealing the topographies of power is one aim of work on socio-technical imaginaries. Topographies of power play a prominent role when the socio-technical imaginaries are extended, meaning they become dominant for a long duration of time and cross geopolitical boundaries. To be precise, institutions such as armies, parliaments, police, judicial system, private industries, as well as science and technology, as Jasanoff admits, are rooted in long processes of unequal world-making, which have transcended geographical boundaries. However, there is no articulation or further explanation on how one can involve these topographies of power into SDI's research, and at the same time be cautious about contingencies and agencies. The problematic of this theoretical absence reveals itself when the reader goes through the chapters 2 to 13, in which SDI's framework has been applied to various geohistorical contexts. For instance, in the second chapter of the book by William Keller Storey on South Africa's, quote, capitalist, segregationist, socio-technical imaginary, end of quote, focuses on Cecil Rhodes, the British imperialist. His statue was removed from Cape Town University the same year Dreamscapes of Modernity was published, 2015. In Dreamscapes of Modernity, however, Rhodes's imaginary's main problem is illustrated as his anti-liberalism and industrializationism. His romantic industrialization imaginary, quote, imported from his home country, end of quote. There is no reference to the British imperial imaginary, political as well as socio-technical, which was at the pinnacle of realization in the late 19th century, when Rhodes was transforming South Africa. The case of Rhodes is not situated in this geohistorical context, as if the segregation and brutal conditions in South Africa emerged from distorted imaginaries of modernity and non-genuine imaginaries which were carried out by Rhodes and his partners. Generally, modernity in the case studies of the book is formulated as the entanglement of processes of democratization, nation building, progress, and industrial development in nation-states. As these nation-states are atomized entities, territories, with histories separated from one another, the relationship between modernity's agents and institutions to colonial past, to global capitalist socio-ecological relations, and the Eurocentric origin of science and technology is mostly washed out from the pages of Dreamscapes of Modernity. Therefore, the question that is raised here is that how colonial history and capitalist socio-ecological relations, these persistent topographies of power, are inscribed in the future imaginaries of modernity. These topographies of power, despite Jasanoff's emphasis, are not articulated through specific agencies and within geohistorical contingencies. Let's go to the picture. Sometimes illustration can help more than words. This cartoon is an interesting manifestation of the rise of science and technology, the future imaginaries of a modern world in 1829. The satirical magazine, March of Intellect, was published in the 19th century for the high society in London and was devoted to advancement in science and technology, a genuine landscape of modernity for London. Let us zoom in. What else do we see in this picture? A vacuum tube to Bengal, a bridge to Cape Town, a scheme for repayment of national debts, and a slinger to shoot off Irish migrants, all of which are manifestations of colonial and capitalist relations woven with the march of intellect. Rhodes' industrialist imaginaries for South Africa were also related to these dominant socio-technical imaginaries being produced at the time in the heart of British Empire. So why the line durée colonial and capitalist relations and institutions are not integral parts of Rhodes' imaginaries in the narration of Dreamscapes of Modernity? I believe the problem arises from the framing of modernity itself. Let us see how modernity is framed in STIs. The term modernity as an era of both salient change and persistent stability is vividly present in the lines of the Dreamscapes of Modernity, in the title of the book, in the title of first theoretical chapter, and the word modern and modernity are repeated more than 150 times in the book. Science and technology are introduced as salient forces of modernity, modernity's ultimate travelers, and modernity is also understood as extended era, historical long durée. Moreover, there is a blueprint of concepts in the first chapter that the reader can follow, such as democratization, formation of nation states, and citizenship, with a sketch of modernity as a European project that started with Enlightenment in the 17th century Britain. There are also critical views on modernity, of course. For instance, Jasanoff calls, quote, intellectual binaries and categorical separation are the characteristic outputs of modernity, end of quote, and she indicates that STIs aims to transcend the knowledge system of modernity. However, there is no further clarification. In another part of the text, Jasanoff disapproves Bruno Latour's uncritical treatment of colonialism when Latour repeats the notions of civilized and barbarity. One can observe there is a tacit acknowledgement that the relation of colonialism should be counted in the institutions of science and modernity, and therefore in formation of socio-technical imaginaries. Here again is no hint to how colonial relations and institutions are related to modernity, how STI should incorporate these uneven relations in a specific geohistorical context. The conceptualization of modernity in STIs is therefore narrowly defined, if not insufficiently. I will introduce and apply another approach from Sheila Jasanoff, namely technologies of humility, to reflect on the framing of modernity in STIs. This approach, introduced in 2018 as a humble approach for global energy futures, which calls researchers to challenge the reach of science and be alert to unquestioned reliance on science and technology, whereas the world problems are as much ethical and political. The objective of technologies of humility is to interrogate our present knowledge by directing our attention to the political and the ethical in order to achieve just energy futures. Kasanoff extracts 4 focal points around which the social science of the energy transition can apply technologies of humility: framing, vulnerability, distribution, and learning. I apply the first step of humility, framing, to STI's modernity by asking the question, what alternatives way can STI's modernity be framed in order to be more attentive to the political and the ethical problems? The representation of modernity in dominant discourses is usually related to the concepts we see on the top of the iceberg. The modernity's STIs is as well occupied with these concepts: reason, democracy, free market, enlightenment, capitalism, colonialism, and prevalence of Eurocentric knowledge system, the plunder and exploitation of extra-human and human nature, as well as other human epistemologies, is not usually associated with the term modernity. But aren't these institutions and relations all emerged and expanded in an era we call modern history? Can we understand the relation and institution illustrated at the top of the iceberg independent from the iceberg underwater? Can we separate them when investigating STIs? If not, why is the underwater iceberg washed out from the pages of the dreamscapes of modernity? My response is the lack of attention to the epistemological order. An order in modern era that Fernando Coronel refers to as Occidentalism. Coronel was a Venezuelan anthropologist who challenged social scientists to rethink their approaches to key contemporary epistemological, political, and ethical questions. My main reference in this presentation is his distinguished article, Beyond Occidentalism Toward Non-Imperial Geohistorical Categories, written in 1996. Fernando Coronel's work is the philosophical compass for post-colonial Marxist geographies introduced by Gillian Hart and embraced by other political ecologists in recent years. This compass is sensitive to the epistemological order of modern era and is capable to fill the gap mentioned above in STI's theoretical foundation. Occidentalism is the epistemological order of the rise of West to global dominance. Coronel argues that, quote, the colonization of the Americas was a turning point in the making of the modern West and in the occidentalization of the world, end of quote. Here arises the first difference with the conventional understanding of modernity, an understanding which associates the emergence of modern world in Europe at home through enlightenment and democratization, which later radiated to other parts of the world as a traveling universal idea. According to Coronel, however, Occidentalism is an imperial epistemology that expresses a constitutive relationship between Western construction of difference and Western worldwide dominance. He argues that, quote, Occidentalism is inseparable from Western hegemony, not only because as a form of knowledge it expresses Western power, but because it establishes a specific bond between knowledge and power in the West. What is central for the argument of this presentation is that this dominance over Americas and later Africa and Asia led as well to the hegemony of Western social thought. Occidentalism, as a modern epistemological order, places Europe or the West not just as the center of history, but also as the source of the theoretical and academic disciplines in terms of which global and local histories have been narrated. As an ensemble of representation practices, Occidentalism consists of accounts that produce polarized and hierarchical conceptions of the West and its others, makes them central figures in meta-narratives of global and local histories that separate the world's components into bounded units, disaggregate their relational histories, turn difference into hierarchy, naturalizes these representations, and thus participate in the reproduction of asymmetric power relations. If STI's framework is sensitive to the asymmetrical power relation, or topographies of power in Jassanov's terminology, modernity's Occidental representation should be at the center of its attention in the studies of imaginaries, especially if STI's framework seeks to identify the unseen and alternative desirable futures. Another aim of STI that Jassanov concludes in the last sentence of the book Dreamscapes of Modernity. I close Modernity's Occidental representation with a long, quote from Fernando Cornell, for his words conclude the humiliation of Occidental modernity at best. Occidental constructs and forms feed the collective imagination and participate in the making of desires and needs. As fetishes of modernity, these cultural formations stand for social powers by alienating them. Parts replace wholes. The West comes to be identified with leading capitalist nations, the economy with the market, democracy with universal elections, difference with otherness. Embodying the contradiction of capitalist society, these formations help shape the landscape within which capitalist arrested development parades as modern progress. So, to illustrate what difference it makes to recognize the Occidentalist representation of modernity, in studying STIs, let us go back to the image in the first slide. This is Southwest Iran, a drawing by Anglo-Persian Oil Company's magazine for British readers in 1951. Iran is company's oil production and refinery site, which provides fuel for British Admiralty, British cars, and lifestyle. A lifestyle described by Ulrich Brand and Marcus Wissen, the imperial mode of living, fulfilling European imaginaries of mobility, urban infrastructures, and energy of a good life centered around private cars. When Jassanov describes cars on the road as the working of the myriad social roles, institutions, and practices spawned by modernity, she names numerous institutions and agencies, including scientists and engineers. But in the emphasis on the role of modernity's institutions in the rise of cars, she dismisses the underwater iceberg. Cars, at least in Britain of the first half of the 20th century, would have never taken to the roads with all its armies of scientists and experts if modernity's asymmetrical power relations and colonial institutions were not established in southwest Iran and later in the whole Gulf region. This picture hides the iceberg under the water, the myriad of institutions and agencies which were at work to extract the oil from southwest Iran. These people are only one fraction of scientists and engineers who put cars on the road in Britain by working around fuel, around the crude matter, petroleum in southwest Iran, geologists, chemists, electrical engineers, etc., etc. However, it is in this gigantic chart that one can get the feeling of all the institutions and agencies at work to extract, refine, transport, and brand the Middle Eastern oil in London. I apologize if the figure is not readable. It is only to illustrate the hierarchy and complexity of only one entity feeding the imaginaries of oil mobility. It is almost impossible today to document all the processes through which this oil complex has established modern institutions and socio-ecological relations, as well as the Occidental epistemologies in the Middle East. Our knowledge today is channeled through the documentations mainly done by the experts from the same complex, especially the understanding of first decades of oil modernization. The reality viewed from their eyes is impartial, if not biased. However, it is possible to trace the imaginaries and desires of these scientists and engineers by reading the private, confidential correspondences, reports, and speeches. In 2019, I visited the archive of Anglo-Persian Oil Company, today's British Petroleum, in Warwick, England, to study how this company reshaped the socio-ecological relations in southwest Iran. This research experience led me to an alertness toward Occidentalism and modernity's full body. Among all these modern institutions which entered southwest Iran by and through Anglo-Persian Oil Company, I have chosen maybe the less relevant of all to petroleum, the desired matter itself. That is the institution of modern medicine and its protagonist in southwest Iran, Dr. Morris Young. By searching on internet, academic journals, and the books on the history of Anglo-Persian Oil Company, most probably one concludes that Young was a pioneer of modern medicine in southwest Persia, Anglo-Persian Oil Company's political agent, and a modest man who had good relations to natives, which facilitated company's good relation with locals. However, by integrating the Occidental epistemologies into the research methodology, studying two documents in BP archive, Dr. Young's Persia correspondences 1911-1912 and his general administration reports in 1926, one can recognize that it was much more to Young's mission in Iran. Along developing modern hospitals and Western medicine in his 3 decades career in southwest Iran, Young was involved in vital dynamics in pursuing the company's interests and introduction of other modern institutions, such as private property, the sanctity of contract and its bylaws, as well as urban segregation. If you're interested in more details on this slide, we can come back later in the discussion. Anyhow, his word reveals that his desirable future for this part of the world is to be safe for gentlemen and their belongings, and to be a humble provider of oil for companies' riches. He and other scientists and engineers' knowledge and expertise, bundled with British companies' power, introduced and established modernity's relation of underwater iceberg deeper and faster than modernity's top of the iceberg. Young was a pioneer of southwest Iran's modernization, but not a pioneer of introducing its cherished forces, such as democracy and reason for natives, for southwest Iran. From the perspective of this British gentleman in science and technology, southwest Iran in the beginning of 20th century was a mere frontier for cheap nature, borrowing the term from Jason Moore, a frontier for petroleum to enrich British capitalism, lifestyle, and empire-building imaginaries, not to realize local people's desired future. The so-called native desired future was for long resisted and oppressed. In this cartoon of mid-20th century, you see Britannica on the left, the new goddess of seas, symbolized British Empire, is disturbed by Mossadegh and Nasser, who are illustrated as less human creatures, who are non-modern, and do not have the knowledge to desire such futures, as you can see on the right page. Cartoon. It was Western construction of difference and Western worldwide dominance, which successfully portrayed Mossadegh's socio-technical imaginaries as inadequate and therefore impossible to realize. It was the antagonism between Iranian nationalization imaginary and gentleman's future imaginaries for the empire, carved in the dominance of the empire, which led to the 1953 coup d'etat to resist the imaginary of oil nationalization. The histories of people are connected, hence their socio-technical imaginaries. Mossadegh's nationalization imaginary evaporates in the air if we do not engage with imaginaries of the empire. So I finished this presentation by raising questions about contemporary dominant imaginaries of green energy, green mobility, and the reproduction of Occidentalism. Maybe Rhodes and even Dr. Young are explicit cases of Occidental representation, formed socio-technical imaginaries of the age of British Empire. But are there other forms of Occidental representation in contemporary green imaginaries? What is seen in the dominant socio-technical imaginaries of a green sustainable future and what is not seen? If one considers the epistemological order essential in formation of future imaginaries, what underwater aspects should be included in our analysis and understanding of energy future? Thank you so much.
Sarah, thank you for your very stimulating talk. Or as Michelle says, thank you for this amazing presentation. So, are there any questions? Yeah, there's the first one. The first question from Abdullah. He asks, can you elaborate on the technologies of humility and the energy transition you mentioned?
Yes. This slide. Yes. This is a more recent work of Shaila Jasanow, and in which she actually invites scientists, social scientists, and environmental scientists to question the capabilities of these institutions. And for example, to interrogate the meaning of progress. What is even progress and how do we define it? And how we should actually change the ways we look at these problems. And basically in these 4 processes, like how first thing that us researchers do is pose questions and try to answer them. So are we framing those questions in a way that are sensitive to the political and ethical problems? That is the first step, maybe. And then the second question is that when we are conducting research, who are we hearing and who we are not hearing? That would be the second one. Who is vulnerable and who is going to probably be hurt? For example, when in the first presentation we were talking about wind turbines, who is going to actually suffer? And who is winning when we are actually promoting these socio-technical imaginaries? And the last 2 are more about actually in the implementation of research in policy, to be more sensitive to participation, more participation by different groups and stakeholders, and also always be open to learning from what we have done and have a feedback loop on these 4 aspects all the time. Yeah, and that was technology. Yeah, that was actually it about the first question.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. For instance, yeah, there are no other questions right now. So perhaps one other question from me. You mentioned these things that are underwater, the aspects of the icebergs that are underwater, but some of these aspects are also over the water, the sea level, also in Occidental concepts like justice, for example. Justice is also a concept that is often used. So do you think that also our concept of justice, when you think about that, that people are affected from our modes of living, our ways of, okay, there was a message from our ways of living or our ways of using technology and so on. Is this also a global north perspective from your point of view?
First, I was trying here to show the actually notions associated with modernity. And usually justice is not associated with modernity. So that's why those four, and maybe more, I just put the most conventional terms associated with modernity. About the Occidentalism, yes, there are different forms of representations, Occidental representations, according to Coronel. Let us talk about what we do in academia. For example, he has, in this article that I mentioned, he has 3 forms of representation, which is defines the relation between West and its other. The first one is dissolving other by self, which is maybe not the case that we have today, meaning that the capitalist system or the Western modernity is radiating to the other parts of the world. The second one is the abolishing of the other by self, which is maybe the very beginning of colonial era, to define the other as barbaric, as not human. And this is why for Europe and for humanity and all of these notions to prevail, the other have to be suppressed. But there is another representation form, which I would say it's more maybe present in critical studies today, is dissolution of self by other. In this form of representation, the self accepts its shortcoming, accepts its wrongdoing through the history. But again, it separates connected histories of people. It still creates an other, and there is an other that we should learn from. And this we is still the European self. And this is very present in today's critical study. So that's why Coronel calls for non-imperial geohistorical categories that can transcend this disaggregation, this territorialization of peoples and their epistemologies and their lives and histories. There is a forced representation form that Coronel talks about in another article 2020, which is related to neoliberalization. And that is, he is talking about the globalization and this new form of representation that we all are in this together. But again, different countries, different regions are introduced as territories completely separate from one another in his metaphor as the balls on a billiard table. That sometimes they get together, sometimes they distance from one another, but they are not understood as a connected system. I believe this is also to be seen in Anthropocene studies, that humans are responsible what is going on without really and systematically acknowledge these topographies of power, or what we have heard in the keynote, that the history of ecological crisis and so on. Yes, I would say it is still present, but in different forms, of course.
Yeah, there are many positive comments here. People are saying thought-provoking work, or I learned a lot from you today, Sarah, but no questions and no other comments. So if there are none, no. And again, great talk, Sarah. So, and you this time you really hear our applause because you can see it from the chat.
Yeah, so, thank everyone.
So thank you very much, Sarah. And I think that okay, then we can finish our discussion here and also finish this first part of our session. So on behalf of everyone, I would like to thank all the speakers for their interesting and for the stimulating presentations, and also for the discussion contributions and questions. And as I said, we will continue the session tomorrow at 10 minutes past 1. So see you again here in the session in our conference. So bye.
Bye.